The challenge with the resale part is that we don't have super clear exemptions, but the investor has to follow the same rules you guys. When they sell that to a third party, they have to either register that security with the SEC, they have to find an exemption, or it's illegal. And so what exemption do they rely on? Because we have to find an exemption, just like we have to find an exemption for you guys. Welcome back to the Real Estate Syndicator Live episode 21. And looking forward to today's episode. I've actually been meaning to do this one for a while. As always, I get these ideas from the Facebook community. If you're not a member of the Facebook community, would love for you guys to join. And then just clients, right? Clients are coming up with questions and we see patterns. Last week we had a lot of questions about lending and what that looked like. And so we got Eric on the show last week. And then today we're going to talk about transfers because, what happens when an investor of yours wants to transfer out before the end of the deal, right? So it's a 5-year, 7-year deal, whether it's an emergency or they just want to get out. What is the mechanism, assuming they find someone, because obviously that's an issue too. There's no real market, so they're going to have an obligation to go find a particular buyer. But let's assume they find a buyer, can they just willy-nilly transfer, or what are the restrictions and all that stuff? So I wanted to go through that today. Maybe a little bit more technical than, me. I always like to keep it high level. I try not to get too into the weeds of the statutes, but I'm going to throw out a couple of statutes for you guys today. I know this is a sophisticated audience, and so I won't go too crazy, but I want to kind of lay the foundation. And so, as you guys know, when you're as syndicators, we're always relying on exemption. Usually it's a 506B, right? 506C, Reg A. These are all exemptions to registration that are available to what we call the issuer. Now, the issuer is just simply you or the syndication LLC if you've got many people. So when you're the issuer of the security, when you're doing your syndication, those are the exemptions we rely on. But when a investor who is not the issuer is taking your syndication or your shares that you gave them and are trying to resell it to a third party, we call that a resale. And obviously they're not the issuer anymore, right? And so the technical piece is that, let's take 506B and 506C because those are the most common. Those, as you guys, I think probably all know, fall under the umbrella of Reg D, right? Regulation D is kind of that regulation that all falls under, and that all falls under the Securities Act. So the real rule is the Securities Act of 1933, and the specific, and you'll see these in all of the offering documents, basically 4A2. Section 4A2 handles the syndication part, right? Section 4A1 handles everybody else that's not a syndicator or issuer or an affiliate of the issuer, like the sponsors or an underwriter or broker, like all those people go into 4A1. But the challenge with the resale part is that we don't have super clear exemptions, but the investor has to follow the same rules you guys. When they sell that to a third party, remember the same rules. They have to either register that security with the SEC, they have to find an exemption, or it's illegal. Now, obviously, if they've got a $50,000 share or $100,000 share and they want to sell it, they're not going to go register it, right, with the SEC, and they're not going to go, spend the money to go do a PPM or any of that kind of nonsense for them. And so what exemption do they rely on? Because we have to find an exemption, just like we have to find an exemption for you guys. And it all depends, and it all comes down to whether they're trying to sell it publicly. In essence, are they generally soliciting advertising? Are they blasting it out to the public? Or is it a private resale? So that's going to be the first level of analysis. And I'm going to start with the public resale for a couple of reasons. Number one, we have a safe harbor exemption similar to 506B and 506C, so it'll be easier to talk about. But I also think that the rule I'm about to talk about, the exemption, is going to apply a lot when we're talking about tokenization. We've talked a little bit about real estate and syndication tokenization, kind of the wave of the future, I think. And the whole point of tokenization is to provide liquidity for investors, and then sell their tokens or their syndication interest in a platform or somewhere to basically create some liquidity. That's going to be all public. It's going to be on a platform. That's going to rely on the exemption. And the exemption that we're talking about is called Rule 144. Rule 144 is a safe harbor, just like Reg 506B and 506C are safe harbors for us syndicators. Rule 144 is a safe harbor for the resale of public when you're trying to do it publicly. And there's about 3 or 4 limitations, but the main ones are really 2. The first one that you probably heard of is that there is a holding timeline restriction. So in order to resell that security, you have to hold that security, for most of us, for a year. And when I say most of us, is because the only time that changes is if you're a reporting company, which most of us are not. And so for most of us, 99.99, the investor has to hold that security for a year before they can pass that and sell that to a third party. The other part that they have to do, which is probably the difficult part, is that they're supposed to provide the buyer of that security when they're selling it, information about the issuer, the syndication, which includes things like their balance sheet for the last 2 years, P&Ls for the last 2 years. Like these are all sort of information that really isn't available publicly, right? And so that's one of the challenges under Rule 144 is that information a lot of times, or most of the time, the syndicator doesn't want to give up. I mean, that's not public information generally. And so it's going to be a little bit of a challenge to get the sponsor, the syndicator, to suddenly release two years worth of financials so you can provide that to the marketplace. So that's probably one of the big hurdles on the 144. Don't forget that the operating agreement that you guys have for your syndication, those contain restrictions as well, right? There's usually a right of first refusal. So even if the investor finds somebody to go sell at a third party, they actually have to first go back to the syndicator and ask them for basically offer it to the syndicator, and they're going to have a right to match the price and the terms of that offering. So you've got to keep those in mind. And then the last thing you want to keep in mind is that the syndicator has an obligation to make sure that they've got a reasonable expectation to make sure that the investor is following the rules as well. And so most of the time there's going to be some sort of a legal opinion requirement, meaning the investor is going to have to get a legal opinion from the attorney or from the counsel for the syndicator that says, hey, this investor is selling it to a third party and they're complying with the securities laws. And so there is some burden on the syndicator to take care of that. But Rule 144 is tough primarily because, well, there's a holding period, which isn't the end of the world, but it's tough because of the public, the information that you're supposed to be providing the buyer of your security as the investor about the syndicator, and it's information that you may not have. A lot of times syndicators just give you a quarterly report. They kind of give you high level financials, right? But in order to get sort of a P&L and a balance sheet for the last 2 years, like actually certified, legit, that might be challenging. But that all has to do with public resales, right? That's kind of the easy part, to be honest with you. So that's kind of the Rule 144, which is that's the safe harbor. For private transactions, we have to rely on Section 4A1, which again, the syndicators, we rely on 4A2. The investor's going to rely on 4A1. The challenge there is there isn't much body of rules and regulations to help us with. It basically just says, as long as you're not, publicly selling that security, you're going to be okay. But what does that mean, right? And so over time, between case law, no action letters, SEC staff, we've kind of developed our own body of rules that we rely on when we're doing a private resale. So that means, hey, I'm an investor. I've got my buddy or somebody that I know. It's going to be a private transaction. I reach out to them on the phone or whatever and say, hey, I've got the security. Would you like to buy it? Let's assume that I've now taken it to the syndicator, given them the right of first refusal. They've declined. So now I'm ready to go sell it to them. What are the restrictions that I'm going to have in order for me to comply under this exemption of Rule 4A? We actually call it 4A 1.5, right? So it's right in between 1 and 2. It's not it's kind of an informal exemption. Like I mentioned, it's been developed over the years between all this stuff. But the 4A 1.5, basically, number one, make sure you don't have any general solicitation or advertising, right? And that kind of makes sense because this is supposed to be the private one. If you're going to generally solicit or advertise, you're going to go with Rule 144, which we just talked about. You want to have less than about 25 buyers, right? And again, for us, I don't think that's going to be an issue. Most of our investors are going to sell it to one other investors or maybe two. I can't imagine in our world anyway that we're in a situation where we're going to sell it to 25 different investors. So I don't think that's going to be a major issue. We want to provide as much information to the buyer about the issuer that's available to us, meaning when I say now us, I mean the investor. So that's not going to be financials, P&L, and balance sheets. It's essentially going to be whatever information I've been able to gather or really are able to gather from the issuer. You want to be able to show that and disclose that, so to speak, to the buyer. So quarterly reports, any financials that you have received from the from the syndicator, you want to give that information to the buyer so they have that information, even though it's not public information, at least it's the information that you've received. And there's no minimum withholding requirement like there is in 144, so we don't have to wait a year. However, you have to be able to show that as the investor, you didn't buy the security from the syndicator with a view to sort of resell it, right? So that's going to make you an underwriter or a broker. So you don't want to be in a situation where you're accused of, well, I'm going to buy this syndication from our good friend Ed Moselle, who's on the call. We're not going to buy it from Ed with the idea that I'm going to sell it to Jonathan over here next week at a higher price, or maybe, you know, he can't get in and I'm going to come up with something like that. And generally speaking, in order to prove that, generally you want to hold that security for about 6 months. So holding it for 6 months, it isn't a 6-month requirement, but the 6 month is sort of the way you show that you didn't buy the security with an intent to sell. So to summarize, sell it to less than 25, make sure you're not generally soliciting or advertising, make sure you're giving the seller all the information about the syndicator that you have, and then let's just call it a 6-month holding period. Again, can you do 5 months or 4 months? Maybe. You're just gonna have to prove, right? It's going to be your burden to show that you didn't buy these from the syndicator with an intent to sort of resell that to an investor. So that's kind of the 4 1.5. Now, you may hear out there back, I think it was 2000 and I want to say 15 or so, because this is not a codified, right? This has just kind of evolved over the years. They actually, the SEC didn't try to codify. They actually codified an exemption. 4A7 is what it came out to. And they came up with some sort of kind of like with Rule 144. Here are the 4, 5, 6 things that you can rely on if you want to transfer this from the private side. The challenge is nobody's using it, and I'll go through the most relevant points, and you'll see why. And that's going to be, you're going to see this primarily on the financial part. But let me get my little list because I didn't memorize it. I'll say nobody uses this, but very few. But I wanted you guys to be aware of it. So number one. Obviously there's going to be no advertising, no general solicitation. That totally makes sense. Your buyer would have to be an accredited investor only to rely on this 4A7 safe harbor. You want to have the securities must have been issued within 90 days, which again, I don't think that's a big deal, but so as long as you bought these over 3 months, basically, you'll be able to do that. But none of you or nobody in the chain of command has ever been a bad actor is another one. The same definition of a bad actor as you guys handle when you guys are doing your own syndication. But the main one, I want to make sure I've got this right because I don't want to screw this one up here. The deal breaker for me anyway is that you've got to provide specific, very similar to this Rule 144, the profit and loss, financial statements, certified in accordance to GAAP. Again, the syndicator, I don't see any way, or very unlikely that a syndicator, I mean, maybe we'll do a poll here, who would be willing, actually put that in the chat. If it's just put yes or no in the chat, whether you'd be willing to provide if one of your investors wanted to sell and is going to sell it to some stranger you've never met and you're not going to buy it, how many of you would be willing to share your 2 years of financials, P&L to those individuals, which then, potentially could be made public. So give me a yes or no, just humor me there. See if we get a little poll here. LOL, yes, not likely. Probably not, right? So anyway, that's one of the main limitations, but I think that and the accredited investor one may be an issue, but most of us will rely on this 4A 1.5. When they came out with that 4A7, they said, look, it doesn't take away the 4A 1.5. You can still rely on 4A 1.5. And so that's the one I think we would all legitimately rely on, which is just make sure you don't advertise, make sure that, you're not doing more than 25. And I think those are sort of more reasonable terms to do the private side. Again, not many people use Rule 144, at least in our world, but I do think more and more people are going to look at it for the tokenization piece, because that's the main reason people are tokenizing syndication these days, is with the idea that, once that 1 year holding period is up, then they're going to be able to sell those tokens, on an exchange or on a, whatever. It doesn't really exist today, but the idea is that that's going to be available pretty soon. So anyway, that's a 15-minute rant. That's actually pretty good for me. So anyway, that's what I have in terms of that. It's a little bit of a dry topic, but I know it's of interest. And so if you've got a question specifically about this, let's raise your hand, and then I'll call on you. And then after that, I'm happy to stick around till the top of the hour. For those of you who came in late, I've got a hard stop here at 5 o'clock today. Unfortunately, I've got the whole team downstairs, and we've got to head out the door. But we'd love to answer questions about this specific topic first, and then if we've got time, we'll open it up to an AMA basically. So anything on this topic? Ed's raising his hand already. Look at Ed. Ed's not using the technology. When I say raise your hand, Ed, it was meant to be press the button that shows the
I'm
electronic.
looking for the button. I can't find the button.
You're good. Take it away, Ed.
So, this just came up. I have an investor that wants to sell privately to somebody else in his family. I went and, my attorney on this is on vacation, go figure, right? And so I looked through the documents and I saw something about must sell to an accredited investor. And I thought that was a mistake because we did a 506B, but maybe it's not a mistake after what you just said.
Yeah, so it looks like they're trying to, on that particular one, rely on this newer, it's been 7 years now, 2015, under the codified safe harbor. Again, something interesting, and I'm not going to punt on that. I'll come back to that, Ed. But something that's interesting is, again, Rule 506B, 506C, these are safe harbors, right? It means like if we comply with these rules, we're sort of assured that we're in compliance with the securities laws. Worst case scenario, if we somehow violate one of those, because safe harbors are very strict, right? I think if you're going to rely on the safe harbor, there's no wiggle room. You got to nail it, right? But if for whatever reason you have a minor violation or you kind of screw up there, you can always kind of fall back on Rule 482, which is really the main statute. It's just harder. There's no assurances. You've got to make the argument. You may have to go in front of a judge or whatever. So same with this one. So instead of saying I'm going to rely on 4A1 or 4A1 and a half, the example you're giving me is let's rely on the safe harbor, which is Rule 4A7, just to kind of get the guarantee on this. But if they're going to rely on 4A7, then the buyer of that security, of that resale, right? Your investor, you're selling it to the buyer. That buyer needs to be an accredited investor in order to qualify for Rule 4A7. So if that buyer is not an accredited investor, and presumably they've come to you, Ed, and said, hey, I've got this buyer, and you're like, I don't want to buy it. I'm going to refuse my right of first refusal. You still want to make sure that they're like what you're doing now, making sure they're compliant with all the rules. Probably best practice to get the legal opinion, even if it's not in your documents. Then if they're not an accredited, then I would just go back to this Rule 4.1 and a half and just make sure that, it's not super restrictive on that side. It's just that, there's, like I said, no general solicitation, provide as much information to the issuer, and just make sure you've held it for 6 months, right? With 4A7, there's no minimum withholding. So if you've only owned it, if the investor's only had it for 2 months, for example, or actually there's gonna be, let's say the investor has it for 4 months, right? Then you would not be eligible for the 4A1 and a half, but you would be eligible for the 4A7. But if this investor is not an accredited investor, then you can't rely on 4A7. You're going to have to go back to 4A1 and a half. I told you there's going to be a lot of technical stuff on this one. So did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
All right, great, Ed, thanks. Anybody want to either raise your hand or just, if you want to, here we go. Kevin's being nice here. Is this about specifically? Is it Irish or Irish, Kevin? You want, or do you want me to read it?
No, it's Irish.
Yeah, sorry. Unmute yourself and then mute yourself back once you're done.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect. It's Irish, Kevin. Got it. Sorry.
Irish, yeah. I'm drinking my Baileys now. That's why I don't want to be in public here.
No, yeah, go ahead. I haven't read it, but it was relevant.
Oh, just the recent question up top was you were talking about releasing like personal information. Are you talking about like financial statements of the actual syndicator, or are you talking about the deal itself?
No, we're talking about the issuer, the actual deal, not the sponsor. And we're not looking for, personal financial data from the sponsor. We're talking about the financials of the issuer, meaning the syndication LLC, right? The name of the deal. So, okay. That's what we're talking about. So similar to if you were doing a Reg A, you got an obligation to provide, audited financials and, throughout the reports. That information is what basically the investor, like again, you saying, well, let's say, Kevin, you're the syndicator, and I'm your investor and I'm trying to sell it to somebody else. I would have to go, hey, Kevin, please provide me with the P&L on the balance sheet for the last 2 years of the syndication LLC, right? ABC, whatever the syndication LLC is. It's not Kevin's personal financial statement where I can see, all of his vacation homes that he owns.
Yeah, yeah, right. I wouldn't have an issue with that if I have an investor that wants to get out,
Yeah.
but
Yeah, and you know, and one of the practical issues, like, you know, a lot of times people are trying to get out. Usually, if it's early, it's because, you know, there's an emergency or whatever. But they just may be a disgruntled investor, right? And you're like more than happy to get them out, and maybe ideally you want to buy it from them, but you know you don't have the means or whatever. Maybe there's whatever the reasons are. So but that would be, and again, that would only apply for well, there's two of them. One would be the Rule 144 and also Rule 4A7. You would have to get that information. 4A 1.5 just seems to be the easiest at this point. It just has lesser restrictions, but again, that only applies to private. So I call up a buddy and have a thing. If I want to put it on social media or put it on exchange or put it on something like that, then it's going to have to be a Rule 144.
I have been noticing recently there's been some platforms coming out and they're actually going to be selling these interests on like secondary market.
Yeah.
So I don't know what kind of rules or what gives them the authority to do it, but
well, we just don't have those markets, but those, I guarantee you, those exchanges are coming. I mean, I was just at an event in Vegas over the weekend, and there's a lot of specifically, I'm thinking now of the crypto space. And when I say crypto space, I really should say more of the tokenization of real estate and the tokenization of syndications, which we're getting a ton of questions about that. We're probably getting 2 or 3 now every single month of syndicators wanting to tokenize their syndications. And the benefit of tokenizing a syndication is that you essentially transform those membership interests, right? Let's say I own 10% of the syndication, right? I'm a 10% owner. We just turn those into tokens so that a year from now, once my holding period, you know, my 1-year holding period expires, I can then put it on some exchange that honestly doesn't really exist today. But to your point, they're coming. And I believe that in the next, you know, year to 5 years, there's going to be plenty of them, that now it affords a secondary market to investors and therefore provides liquidity, which obviously would be a game changer, because now investors can invest in a syndication, and then after 2 or 3 years, if they want to, they can sell half of that or a piece of it, or they've got this sort of trading mechanism which doesn't exist today. It's just a very illiquid market, and this Rule 144, along with the tokenization, provides that, you know, that secondary market and some liquidity in the process, which is great.
Yeah, I'm following them already. They're already out there, and they're just offering the shares that you know, any typical investor would have as an LP. So
yeah,
they are selling just the way they are. So
yeah, well, it sounds like they might be the issuers too. So that might just be going back.
Oh no, they're a platform. They're not the issue.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So they're just platforms that are reselling, almost like OpenSea or something, or they're just reselling syndication.
Oh, if you want to know the name, it's secondary.
Yeah, yeah. So they're starting to pop up. I don't know how liquid they are or how many deals they have there, but they're coming. They're coming, and Rule 144 is going to be the exemption that the investor who owns the shares, you know, that is trying to resell, and that's what they're going to start using, because obviously that's a public platform, so they're going to have to do Rule 144.
Okay, good to know.
Kevin, thank you, man.
Yep.
Let's see what else we got here. Anybody else have a question specific to? Let's try and get one more into this, and then I'll just open it up to AMA if everybody's got a question. If not, we've got 6 more minutes. So, anybody got a question on this topic? All right, well, then I'll open it up to any question at all. If you guys have any generic question about syndication or legal stuff, or, you know, happy to answer those as well.
Mauricio, do you see the other follow-up question regarding the P&L and T3s and T6s?
Yeah, I saw that. Let me just read it here. It says,
you just kind of maybe.
Do you need authorization from sponsor to release some of recent reports regarding the operations income? It depends on whether there's some confidentiality agreement or something that you've promised not to release those. It just depends on how it gets disseminated. I mean, sometimes the sponsors put it on a private platform, and there's language in there that prohibits you from sharing that, or sometimes they just blast out an email and it doesn't. So in my mind, if it's been blasted out to everyone and there's been no specific, you know, requirement that these are, you know, acknowledged that these are private and should not be reshared, then no. But if you've entered into some agreement, there's certainly no legal impediment, you know, from a statutory standpoint, that you can't reshare that. But if you've entered into a private contract that you've agreed not to, there's some confidentiality or non-disclosure, then yes, you'd want to get you know, some written permission from them. And that's always the issue in terms of you know, in terms of some of these resales. But again, most syndicators don't want to have a disgruntled investor in their deal. So if somebody's not happy, there's a reason why they want to get out. You're just better off, in my opinion, it's not a legal thing, but you're better off authorizing that so that they can actually get out and you don't have to deal with a problem investor if that's one of the reasons they're trying to get out.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. All right, guys. Well, I know this was a short one. I appreciate the patience here. As I said, I got the whole team here, so we're going to go take off. But don't forget, next week, we've got Alex Kogan, who's going to be our KP. I've got a lot of questions about KPs. If you joined us late, we've got a key principal, Alex Kogan, joining us next week, and he's going to talk all about, what does it take to get into a relationship with a KP? What are they looking for? What are they charging? All that stuff, because that's been a big thing in the community. One other question before I go. I just saw a question from Andrea. Andrea, you want to ask your question real quick, and then we'll wrap it up? Unmute yourself.
Sure. We're just now getting into the syndication, and we're trying to put together our team and looking for mentors and stuff. And there's so many, paid mentors out there that charge, thousands and thousands of dollars, and they all sound wonderful. But I would like to talk to, some real people to find out how to really do it, and if any of these paid mentors are worth paying for.
Yep. And I'm just putting in here, if you go to, I would pose that question to the Facebook community. Are you a member of the community yet? The Facebook group?
I'm not sure.
They're
actually
super responsive. And so it's mauriciorauld.com/FB group. I'm just putting in the chat. I screwed up the first one, so I'm putting it again. And people post there all the time, and the community is pretty engaged. And then I'm also happy to, give you my thoughts. I'm affiliated with several mentors, and I'm happy to share some of those. I know, Ed, you've got a couple mentors that you work with. Actually, we're in a couple masterminds together. So I would post that in the group there, and I live there, so I'll see it right away.
Oh, okay.
So. All right, everyone. Well, again, apologize for the short one this week, but let's hopefully see you guys next week for the KP and get your questions ready to figure out how to get these key principles. And Ed may be a key principal too. Maybe you should join us, Ed. All right, everyone. Good seeing everyone. Thank you.